There's something about having your own space that brings a kind of calm nothing else can replace. For Nick, that personal sanctuary was the garage behind his house. It wasn't just where he parked his car, it was his little workshop, his storage spot, and most importantly his refuge from the constant noise of everyday life. In that garage, Nick kept a few prized possessions, but none were more remarkable than his two tigers, Bengal and Zara. While some folks collected exotic cars, Nick's unusual passion leaned toward exotic animals. These two big cats had been rescued from a failing wildlife reserve some years back, and after extensive paperwork and licensing, Nick gave them a better life, a large specially built enclosure attached to the garage, perfect for them to lounge comfortably when not out in a bigger sanctuary. For Nick, they weren't just showpieces, they were beloved companions, each with distinct personalities. That sense of contentment Nick felt in his home and garage was hard-won, especially in a neighborhood overshadowed by a meddlesome HOA. Or more specifically, overshadowed by the HOA's self-proclaimed queen, Karen. She liked to present herself as everyone's caretaker, making sure community standards were upheld. In reality, it meant controlling every aspect of people's property, from mailbox colors to the height of lawn grass. She demanded that trash bins be brought in 5 minutes after collection, and that no unapproved items, like say Nick's tigers, ever appear without going through endless paperwork. Nick had mostly ignored her. He had all the permits for his animals, and the local wildlife authorities were satisfied. But Karen, she believed her HOA position trumped all. Karen's biggest problem wasn't that Nick owned tigers. She likely didn't even know the extent of how they lived behind the secure part of the garage, well within the guidelines set by proper authorities. Instead, her problem was that Nick's property existed outside the narrow aesthetic mold she wanted to enforce. So she nagged and scolded, but Nick's answer was always the same polite refusal. He had spent countless hours reading the local rules. He knew exactly what the HOA could and couldn't do. His private garage and well-constructed enclosure were beyond Karen's control. Still, she hovered around like she was waiting for any slip-up, any reason to strike. And then one evening, Nick came home late from his job at a construction site. He was tired, sweaty, and ready to take a shower before feeding Bengal and Zara. But as soon as he pulled into his driveway, his headlights revealed something bizarre: a car parked inside his closed garage. The doors had been left partly open, and some battered sedan was lodged in the center, as if it owned the space. Nick slammed his truck door and strode over, heart pounding with anger at the audacity. Peering through the windshield, he realized the driver's seat was reclined, and there, quietly dozing, was Karen herself. At first, Nick could hardly process the scene. Karen, the unstoppable HOA busybody, was napping in his personal garage, inside her own car, as though it were her rightful domain. He tapped the window. She didn't stir. He knocked louder. No reaction. Leaning closer, he glimpsed an empty cup in the cup holder, and the engine was off. She had apparently driven in, turned off the car, and promptly dozed off. The gall of it nearly made him laugh out loud. This was beyond petty, it was insane. She didn't have any reason to be here. And even if she found some reason, this was private property, his property. Nick felt the surge of frustration, quickly followed by a mischievous idea. Over the past months, Karen's petty intrusions and complaints had worn on his patience. Now it was her turn to get a taste of her own medicine. If she wanted to treat his property like hers, maybe she needed a little surprise. That's when his gaze wandered toward the secure enclosure at the far side of the garage, where Bengal and Zara typically spent the evening. They were docile with him, used to his presence, but with strangers, they certainly commanded respect. And if Karen believed she was unstoppable, 2 adult tigers would make her question that real quick. Before he acted, Nick double-checked the risk. He certainly didn't want Karen harmed, he just wanted to startle her enough that she'd never dare cross the line again. Both tigers had historically calm temperaments, but strangers, especially ones moving unpredictably, could prompt them to posture and intimidate. His plan would be purely psychological. He cracked open a hidden door in the enclosure, one that allowed them partial access to the interior of the garage, but still separated them from the rest of the world by a locked steel partition. They could roam in the area near Karen's car, but they couldn't physically reach her if she stayed in the driver's seat or tried to run out. It was a setup ensuring neither side actually got hurt. It was a calculated lesson. He whistled softly, and sure enough, Bengal, the older and more regal male, sauntered out first, sniffing at the new environment. Zara followed behind, tail swishing, curious about the unfamiliar smell of a strange car. Nick stepped aside, letting them do as they pleased. They padded around the garage, tails flicking, heads turning at every sound. He watched as they circled near Karen's sedan. With any luck, that alone would do the job. He half expected her to jolt awake at the shuffle of paws on concrete, or the faint huffing sounds tigers sometimes make. She didn't budge, at least not immediately. Karen was evidently in a deep sleep. Nick found himself stifling a laugh, imagining the meltdown she'd have once she realized her predicament. The plan was simple. Once she woke, she'd see the tigers outside her car, panic, and realize maybe it wasn't so wise to trespass in Nick's garage. Then Nick would let her out, that was it. No real harm, but definitely a big scare. Perhaps she'd stop treating neighbors like her personal punching bags. Finally, after nearly 10 minutes of quiet pacing by the tigers, Karen stirred. Nick noticed her shift in the driver's seat, blinking groggily. She started to yawn, then her eyes locked onto a silhouette that definitely wasn't normal for a garage. Bengal, standing close to the front of the car, looking directly at her through the windshield. In an instant, Karen's eyes went wide as dinner plates. She scrambled upright, confusion turning to utter terror. She let out a muffled squeal, pressing herself back against the seat. Nick watched quietly from behind a shelving unit, trying to keep from breaking into laughter. The moment Karen recognized there wasn't just one but two tigers, a high-pitched shriek tore from her mouth. She clutched at the steering wheel, frantically scanning for an exit. But the car doors were locked from inside, and behind her was a locked garage door with no easy egress. "Help!" she screeched, voice trembling. "Oh my God, tigers!" Her words choked off in a panicked cough. Bengal merely flicked his tail, unimpressed, but Zara, hearing Karen's shrill cry, paced closer on the passenger side. That forced Karen to jerk her head around, and with each movement, she seemed more and more frantic. Nick expected fear, but he hadn't expected the allergic meltdown that followed. Karen started hacking and sneezing violently, a bizarre reaction that momentarily took Nick by surprise. At first, he thought she was choking from panic, but soon he recognized it as a severe allergic response. Her eyes watered, her sneezes came in rapid succession. She squeaked out stammered pleas. I can't breathe, let me out." Inside, Nick's conscience pricked him. Sure, this was a comedic scenario in his mind, Karen terrorized by two big cats and forced to face some humility. But she was clearly in real distress from an allergy. He didn't want her truly harmed or hospitalized. So he weighed the fun of scaring her against the moral responsibility not to let an allergic reaction escalate. Still, a few more minutes might suffice to drive the lesson home. She was sneezing so uncontrollably that tears streamed down her face. She fumbled at the door handle, yanking it, but the door clattered against the metal frame Nick had installed. She was trapped. The tigers prowled around, not overtly aggressive, more curious about the sudden commotion. Karen coughed, eyes red, voice trembling. "Please, someone help me, I'm allergic, oh God." Another harsh sneeze interrupted her. She pressed both hands over her mouth, helpless. Nick decided it was time. He stepped forward from behind the shelves, making sure she could see him approach. Her eyes flickered, partly relieved, partly even more petrified, as if she thought he might open the door and let the tigers in with her. Carefully, Nick approached Bengal and Zara, giving them each a calm stroke on the shoulder to signal they'd done enough. They recognized his presence, and instantly toned down the excitement. Then he turned to Karen, who watched him as if he were her only lifeline. He walked to a hidden switch near the interior. With a metallic clang, the partition gate swung aside, giving the tigers a way back into their main enclosure. Nick patted Zara's flank, and she padded away obediently. Bengal followed soon after, leaving Karen's path to the garage door open. Freed from the cat's watchful presence, she exhaled with a ragged gasp of relief. Nick stepped closer to the driver's side door. Karen tried to open it again, squeaking in desperation. He motioned for her to calm down, pressed a button, and the main overhead door began to lift. Fresh air flowed in. Karen seemed to drink it up, still sneezing but less violently, tears glistening on her cheeks. Finally, Nick unlocked the car door from the outside with a small remote. She practically fell out, stumbling onto the driveway, half collapsing on the concrete. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes rumpled, face blotchy from allergy and tears. She stared up at Nick, too winded to speak at first. He folded his arms, letting her catch her breath. Karen coughed again, rubbing her eyes. You have tigers," she managed to sputter between sneezes. "Sure do," Nick replied coolly. "I keep them in a secure enclosure. Didn't expect anyone would barge in uninvited." She blinked, still clearly rattled. I didn't know, why on earth?" Nick shrugged. "I guess you figured my garage was your personal space. That was your first mistake. The second was not realizing you might not be alone in here." Her chest rose and fell, adrenaline still in her veins, but she was quiet. The characteristic arrogance that usually graced her posture was nowhere to be found. She finally stammered, I'm sorry. I just needed somewhere to park for a quick minute. I didn't think you'd mind." He let out a short sardonic laugh. "Well, I minded, and guess what? This is exactly what happens when you think you can take over other people's property. Did you have fun?" Her face twisted, half contrite, half humiliated. She tried to speak, maybe to throw out some half-baked excuse, but she only sneezed again, rubbing her sore nose. Nick recognized that, for the first time, Karen was at a total loss for words. Maybe she'd think twice, before meddling in neighbors' affairs again. A few curious neighbors peered out windows. If they saw Karen in this state, that'd be the best end of the story Nick could hope for. She was caught in her own arrogance, undone by two majestic animals, and her own unstoppable allergy. And he realized that was enough. She might deserve an even bigger comeuppance, but seeing her cough and sputter on the driveway, thoroughly humbled, gave Nick the sense that the point had been made. He gestured at her car. "You can move it now, my garage isn't your personal parking spot. Next time, maybe ask." Karen managed a nod, rummaging for her keys. She started the car, reversing it out gingerly into the street. Then she climbed out again, still shaky. She gave Nick a look that was part embarrassment, part residual fear. I won't do it again," she rasped. As if that was the best she could muster. This was a misunderstanding. Nick rolled his eyes. "Call it whatever you want, just don't let it happen again." He waited for her to drive away. She stood there another moment, seemed like she wanted to protest or say something more, but sneezed again instead. Probably deciding that the best escape was leaving, she got back in, slammed the door, and sped off in a half-panicked, half-dazed manner. Nick exhaled, glancing at the open garage with amusement. He whistled softly, and in the distance, he heard Bengal and Zara letting out low huffs from inside their enclosure. They'd done their job. The uninvited guest was gone. Please subscribe and check out my channel for more stories like this. Subscribe. But the real question was whether Karen would remain humiliated enough to keep her distance from now on. Nick considered how, at every HOA meeting, she used to stand at the podium and lecture people about guidelines, often insulting them in veiled ways. Maybe next time, she'd hold her tongue, worried that Nick might mention the day she fell asleep in his garage, and nearly had a heart attack upon meeting two enormous tigers. In the following weeks, neighbors whispered rumors about Karen's meltdown. Word traveled fast in small communities. Some said they heard screeches from Nick's garage that day. Others joked Karen was going to pass new rules, banning exotic animals from the neighborhood. But Nick knew she couldn't. His setup was fully licensed by the state, and she had no jurisdiction to override that. The best part was, Karen seemed to keep a very low profile afterward. She stopped dropping in unannounced. The petty fines for mailbox color or yard decor slowed to a trickle. People quietly thanked Nick, guessing he'd given Karen a reality check. One afternoon, about a month later, Nick was tidying his yard when Karen's car passed by, drifting slowly. She eyed his property, saw the large sign near the enclosure that read "Authorized Personnel Only," and glanced around as if half expecting two tigers to leap out. She quickly turned her gaze forward and drove on. Nick smirked. It was a silent acknowledgement of the new status quo. Karen, dethroned from her self-anointed seat of power, was content to leave Nick alone. As for Nick's tigers, they carried on as usual, none the wiser that they'd orchestrated the best scare of the season. He continued to feed them, maintain their enclosure, and occasionally let them roam the garage under controlled conditions. He liked to think they got a thrill out of that day too. After all, seeing a wide-eyed intruder flail around might have been a welcome break from their normal routine. And Nick? He took an odd sense of satisfaction from the entire incident. Not that he wished any real harm on Karen, but sometimes a person who lives by intimidation needs a taste of her own medicine. The best part was no one got hurt, and if her allergic meltdown was unpleasant, well, so was cutting into others' personal business. Nick believed in teaching by example. In the weeks that followed, the HOA saw changes. Another neighbor found the courage to stand up to Karen's petty demands, referencing Nick's situation as proof that they didn't have to cower. The board eventually placed some checks on Karen's power, limiting her capacity to unilaterally decide fines or investigate minor violations. Freed from her constant meddling, the neighborhood breathed easier. If there was a moral to be gleaned from it all, Nick reflected it might be this: some folks only learn boundaries when forced to face consequences they never expected. Karen had tried to commandeer Nick's garage, like it was her rightful property. She ended up with two tigers politely but firmly telling her otherwise. Maybe that's not the standard approach to dealing with an entitled HOA president, but for Nick, it worked wonders. And ironically, after it all ended, Nick realized he bore no actual grudge. Karen would remain in the neighborhood, presumably with a far humbler attitude, and Nick was content to let sleeping dogs, well, sleeping tigers, lie. He'd keep to his projects in the garage. Bengal and Zara would keep strolling around behind that steel partition. And if Karen ever forgot the lesson and tried something similar, he had a feeling she'd recall, at the last second, the memory of those giant feline eyes glaring from the shadows, and think better of it. In the end, Nick's garage returned to its usual calm state, the place he could tinker with his tools and enjoy the presence of his two majestic companions. Karen never parked in his spot again, never tried to step over that line. Peace settled back into Nick's life, and a subtle hush of respect, fear, maybe, held Karen in check. Some might call that justice served. Nick would simply call it nature taking its course. The bigger cat always roars loud enough to keep trouble away. And so it was that a simple desire for personal space led to the meltdown of the neighborhood's most overbearing figure. Nick didn't boast about it. He didn't need to. Everyone else in the community, witnessing Karen's sudden politeness and hush, quietly guessed that Nick, with the help of a couple of fearless tigers, had shown the queen of the HOA exactly why boundaries matter. Sure, it was an unusual method. Most people don't keep tigers in their garage. But then again, most people don't park without permission in a space housing an apex predator. Karen learned the difference that day, and the entire neighborhood found a new sense of calm, one that Nick intended to protect. After all, it was his garage, his refuge, and nobody would claim it again. Please subscribe, and check out my channel for more stories like this. Subscribe.